Well, let me start off by saying, just to add to the encomia, that the summer of '89, I finally sort of figured out what had been going on, dealing intensely with the collapse of communism and trying to figure out what was going on, reading an essay which I think to this day is one of the most important of the 20th century, which is The End of History, originally as an essay, later as a book, in national interest, which of course all kinds of people who take things literally have attacked that for the following almost 30 years. I nonetheless believe that the fundamental thesis that there is no argument anymore, or there was no longer, has not been an argument against liberal democracy since basically the ultimate victory over communist rule in least Europe. I can't say about elsewhere, but there's not much of an argument today. And so I'm really happy to be here almost 30 years later on the stage with Frank to discuss where it's heading, because while we may have had the ultimate victory and there's no competing, overarching approach to governance and the way individuals live in society, I think from two different angles, Frank and I are very concerned about how long we can keep it up, basically. I mean, it's, and I guess to sort of frame the way sort of our different approaches to some of these issues is that Frank has written extensively, and especially in his most recent second volume of this two-volume book, about the decay of institutions and how these things start to fall apart and what we can do. And we can see this disintegration and decay all around us without even getting political about it. But if you just look at events in Europe and in the United States, in the liberal democratic world, we see from, basically from the eastern edge to here on the western shores of the United States, that the institutions that were quite strong and maintained liberal democracy against major threats that were faced basically, that's why we have NATO, right? I mean, by competing and illiberal totalitarian regimes, those threats sort of in that form are gone, yet our own institutions tend to, they're in trouble. My approach, which I'll launch into in a minute, is basically on top of that decay, which may be part of a maybe natural cycle, what we fail to realize, and this is my fundamental thesis, is how much things have changed in the past 15 years in the way we live our lives, even though we may not see it as much as it ought to be, I mean, as much as there is, because so much of the change has taken place, I guess, figuratively, which I would say the back office. I mean, our lives, I mean, how different, I mean, what is noticeable about our lives that's different today? Well, we have mobile phones. Okay, well, that's a great development. And we have Facebook, and we can communicate with our friends, and we can get more news on Twitter. What we don't see, except for its effect, is how digitized, in fact, our lives have become behind. I mean, what enables all of this is a complete reorganization in the way our lives, our ordinary lives, are sort of basically run through digitization. Now, this is most obvious, and as I've talked, that sort of given fairly long lectures, but nonetheless, we see this in way elections have changed, thanks to this huge change. I mean, we have direct hacks of candidates, and Clinton, Macron in France. We have targeted ads now that that completely sort of obviate the rules and regulations that, for example, in the United States and other countries about you have an ad and it said this was paid for by so-and-so, and then you have the candidate saying, I'm so-and-so and I endorse this ad, and on top of the ad is seen by everyone, and so that kind of limits how obnoxious you can get. Whereas today, you get individually targeted ads. You don't know who paid for it. You don't know where it came from. And as we have found out, subsequently, some of these ads don't necessarily even come from Americans. And similar things, as we know, happen elsewhere. This is enabled by a highly, new form of well, basically a digital technique, and we get highly granular analyses of who someone is based on an analysis of big data. So you can, in fact, target individual people based on their preferences as gleaned from their social media, and this is a service offered by, for example, Facebook. There was a classic example, a really obnoxious example, but it was a journalistic test last summer where journalists said, okay, let's see what we can get onto Facebook. And they went to where they do the advertising, and they said, well, we want to target people who hate Jews, are like Nazis, and so forth, and put in a series of criteria, and automatically you got an answer. Well, here are 3,250 people, or roughly that number, that you can target your ads to. You just have to pay your pennies to be able to do that, and you can download. You upload the ad, and the people get it. This would be unfathomable 15 years ago. Yet, this is a means to manipulate elections. We see, another case, basically fake Facebook groups called demonstrations, one among white nationalists and another one among a sort of pseudo Black Lives Matter group for the same time in the same place. And fortunately, it didn't turn into violence. But this is something organized from the outside, and you have a demonstration for no real reason except for it was put together in St. Petersburg. We have, not St. Petersburg, sorry, not Florida. We have Twitter bots that amplify, these computerized tweets that can be repeated and repeated and repeated and over and over, and in fact spreading untrue events or untrue various theses. We have companies that sell Twitter accounts or use them, if you read the New York Times magazine piece this past weekend, that actually sort of hijack your identity. And so there's a poor girl from 17 who was from Minnesota, and she was also tweeting massively in Indonesian, in Indonesia. And we have fake news itself, which is a horribly overused word, and it's been co-opted by certain people in the U.S., but originally and technically meant that, and what it means to me, at least to this day, are fake news sources, made-up news sources. A lot of them in 2016 were made up in Macedonia for some reason, but because you can generate money that way, and carrying stories that are untrue, and put on Facebook with as we know post hoc. More of those genuinely false news stories were shared than were shared true news stories on Facebook in the 3 months leading up to the U.S. election. Now, we see the same thing not only in the United States, except it's better documented because, well, the U.S. is more aware of this, but we see it repeated across the liberal democratic world. We have had elections where, we know now, in retrospect, that the UK Brexit referendum was a victim of this kind of attack. Afterwards, we know the Netherlands, the referendum on Ukraine and the association agreement, which the the Dutch turned down, was also manipulated. We know that the Italian reform referendum, again, afterwards, in fact, had been manipulated, where the prime minister's sort of proposal to reform the Italian constitution was rejected. We have the elections in the Netherlands, the French presidential election where Macron was hacked, I mean the winner ultimately, and virtually all sort of massive social media support for the populist Marine Le Pen. We had last week's Czech elections, and there's quite a bit of news this week about this massive campaign in favor of the person who ultimately won, sort of a anti-immigrant populist, and the most awful kind of slander against the rather retiring, unassuming professor who was running against him. We know now that depending on who you ask, 85 or to 90 or 97% of the social media, sort of agitating social media on the Catalonia versus sort of Spain controversy that has been going on for a while was actually generated in cooperation between Russia and Venezuela. Because as opposed to the US, or we don't have, there are not enough people with the requisite skills in Spanish to actually do a good job on agitating people. And then we heard from National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster just a while back that the same thing is being done in Mexico, and there's a presidential election coming up, a campaign going on right now. Okay, I just mention these things as things that were not possible 15 years ago. They're completely new, and they represent a challenge to one of the fundamental pillars of liberal democracy, which are free and fair elections that are transparent and open, that we have relied upon and do rely. I mean, ever since we started having free and fair elections, beginning in this country and later on spreading to Europe in the 19th century, and sort of now with newly liberated Europe has been the norm in Eastern Europe as well for almost 30 years. So this has had a huge, not only do we have this huge effect on elections, but I would argue that it dramatically decreases something fundamental to democracy, which is trust. If you don't have, which is another theme of Frank Fukuyama, that if you don't have trust in your institutions, in the procedures of democracy, you don't have democracy, or it will not last for long. And what we have now, and what has been propagated, purposely by some of the sort of enemies of open society, to use Popper's phrase, and is also propagated by people within countries domestically, is a loss of faith in what is truth, what is a fact. I mean, you even have an advisor to the US president saying that something is an alternative fact. This whole idea of seeing is believing, the fundamental truths of empiricism, that you see it, you have to see it for it to be true, is declining, and I fear for worse, because already today, but not at a sufficiently high level of quality, you can essentially sort of Photoshop videos. I mean, you can, and we will. I mean, I talked to Eric Schmidt. He says basically in about a year, the technology will be so far that you can fake any video, any voice, and make anyone say anything that you want. I mean, I've seen some of these videos with Barack Obama made to say silly things that were shown as a test of what can be done. And there have been cases, of course, with pornography used the same way. But I mean, I think that it's just this is all going to get worse. This leads to a dramatically reduced faith in political leaders. And especially, I mean, the interesting thing about what's happened with political leaders is that it doesn't matter if they lie anymore. I mean, it used to be that was the kiss of death, right? I mean, if you're a politician, you say, this, and then it turns out you were lying, your credibility, as would be expected, would decline. We don't see that happening anymore. When political leaders are caught in a lie, it seems to not make any difference, which I suspect is partially due to this diminution of faith in the truth. And so, what is the effect? There's a recent poll, I think it was by Pew, and this is for me the most worrisome. It was like, what is the best form of government? And people over 50, also, across various countries in Europe, said democracy. Millennials, it was in the low 20s of democracy, and that authoritarian or a strong leader, they didn't say authoritarian rule, but having a strong leader doing what needs to be done was preferred by people who are in their 20s today. So if you think demographically, people my age, we're kind of like, we won't be around that long compared to, my son's generation. And if people in Europe think that, democracy is kind of a weak way of doing things, there could be trouble ahead. And to sort of close up on this, my sort of side of what is new and what's dangerous, and then we'll go on to what's dangerous on the other side, is that we have to, something needs to be done, and we haven't really figured out what it is. How do we remedy this situation? And right now we're proceeding just sort of letting it all be. As the effects accumulate, as we notice them, I do fear that some of the responses that will come to this, which we already have seen in, say, Germany, for example, with last summer's law on the net, a single word, one-word law, the Netzdurchsetzung, Gesetz, being a German word, but basically penalizes social media for not taking down within 24 hours posts that violate German law. And this is getting dangerously close to restrictions on freedom of expression. President Macron has come out, he wants an even stronger law. So one of the things that I fear we will face is kind of like rather ham-fisted responses to these new challenges that in and of themselves already will represent a restriction on fundamental rights and freedoms as we are accustomed to enjoying and exercising within liberal democracy. So those are the new challenges. But then we have the other side of the thing, which is how what we have is doing, which is your area.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. So thanks to Stanford Libraries and its supporters for making this possible. So Thomas is a very wise person. I don't think we fundamentally disagree on any of these issues. We agreed on a little bit of a division of labor, and I want to step back from the technology and the direct impacts of things like social media, talk a little bit about the drivers, the social and political drivers of what's going on. So the threat to democracy right now has been given a name, which is populist nationalism. Essentially, a populist is a politician who uses the fact that he or she is popular, that is to say legitimated through democratic elections, and uses that, establishes a direct connection with the people that supported him or her, and then accumulates power, but is almost intrinsically anti-institutional, meaning if I get this mandate directly from you, the people, and then there are these courts, or there's the media, or a bureaucracy that's standing in the way of my doing what I've promised you I will do, I don't like that, and they then use their power to undermine those institutions. And so the real victims of this are the other important, so the democracy part is still there to some extent. What is really damaged in this process are the other institutions, that is to say, the rule of law, an impartial bureaucracy, all of the checks and balances that actually make up a functioning, modern, liberal democracy, all right? And there are a number of people, Thomas has already mentioned several of them, that have been put in this category. So grandmaster of all of them is Vladimir Putin, who does seem to be actually popular in Russia, but has certainly dismantled both law, the opposition, the media, and so forth. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jaroslaw Kaczynski in Poland, President Erdogan in Turkey is another variety of this. And I'm afraid to say in Western democratic countries, we have a number of examples of this, I would say, including, and this is not a partisan statement, this is a purely analytical statement coming from a political scientist. I would say the President of the United States today bears many of the characteristics that we associate with this kind of populist nationalism. The nationalism, by the way, refers to the fact that for this type of politician, the people that he or she is responding to is not the whole population. There's a certain subset of the population, usually defined by race or ethnicity or possibly religion, that defines who the true people are. And that's, so that person claims to be their representative. And the threat, therefore, is not in a certain way to democracy, because populist nationalists are responding to real democratic discontents. There's lots of angry, unhappy people out there. The threat is really to the other parts of a democracy, all the check and balance institutions, to the rule of law, to a free media, and the like. So that's the thing that we're asking, whether this is going to survive. Now, I think that there are three broad drivers of this. The first one is economic, which has been discussed almost ad nauseum since the beginning with the Brexit vote in 2016. So all of you who have taken a basic international trade theory course will know that the economists say if you have a system of open trade, movement of goods, people, investment, ideas across national borders, that should maximize everybody's aggregate benefit, which is true. Global economy has grown like gangbusters since the 1960s, 70s. It's quadrupled, really, since 1970. So there's a lot of new wealth that has been created, but again, as that same theory will tell you, not every individual in every country benefits, and in particular, people with lower skills and less education in rich countries have tended to lose employment to similarly skilled workers in poor countries, just because you can pay them less. And so there's been this big outsourcing of manufacturing jobs and a broad decline of working or middle class populations in rich countries. And that's kind of the core of the base of support for example, the Front National. So a lot of working class French people, members of trade unions, who were militantly kind of labor rights people, had voted either communist or socialist for, their parents and grandparents had voted for a left-wing party, but now they're voting for the National Front. And similarly, a lot of working class Americans, white Americans that had voted for the Democratic Party, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt, have increasingly turned Republican. And that's actually why Donald Trump won the election. 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, he won in the Electoral College because enough working class voters left the Democratic Party and voted for him, right? So that's, I think, fairly well understood. It's actually a shrinking minority of the population. It's also not just working class state, it's also residents. Jonathan Rodden in our political science department, there's a nice study that shows that the strongest correlation between the Trump vote and the Brexit vote is actually with population density. So it's people that do not live in urban clusters, in coastal cities, but even in the capitals of red states. Those tend to vote Democratic, and everybody else in the countryside has been voting Republican. So that's the economic side. There's a political side, which has to do with the dysfunctionality of many modern democratic governments. And this is actually what Thomas was referring to that I was writing about before the rise of all of this populist nationalism. A lot of democratic systems just haven't functioned that well in terms of being able to make difficult decisions and delivering good results for their populations. It has created something I labeled vetocracy, meaning in a modern democracy, lots of interest groups have veto power over decisions by the whole, and the result is paralysis. And so, case number one is the US Congress. I mean, even with the Republican majorities in both houses and the presidency, they still had a shutdown, which is kind of amazing. I mean, the Congress has not passed a budget under regular order for more than 20 years now, and that's not the way a democracy is supposed to function. Italy has had similar problems. Japan has had similar problems. India, particularly under the previous Congress government, has had similar problems. And in each case, this has generated demand. I mean, and maybe this is where it's coming from, this poll data that Thomas was citing, for a strong man to get them out of this situation. That we want somebody that's going to cut through all the blather and disagreement and just, get things done. So I think, Modi in India, Abe in Japan, and Trump in the United States, all of these individuals, I think, profit from the perceived dysfunction of existing democratic political systems. Now, the third driver is my favorite one. So this little self-advertisement, I have a book coming out on this in September on identity and identity politics, but it's basically a cultural driver, and in certain ways, I think it's both the most important and the least well understood or perceived, and it's very closely related to the economic displacement. All right, so identity, modern identity means I have a self, an inner self that should be respected, but it's not getting the respect that it deserves. And there are many things going on in the world, so nationalism is driven by this. Chinese speak of 100 years of humiliation. Putin talks about, NATO and the West disrespecting modern Russia, not being willing to grant it, status as a great power. But also voters, feel this way, and in particular, the people who vote for populist parties in Northern Europe and in the United States are not poor people that have simply been marginalized and left out of economic growth. They tend to be middle-class voters or working-class voters that thought of themselves as middle class, who have lost income, but what my income and job are markers of status. It shows that society values me. And so if I lose my job and I'm making less money than my father or my grandfather, or even worse for a male worker, my wife is making substantially more than me, and this just doesn't seem like a proper situation. I perceive that, of course, as an economic loss, but I also perceive it as a cultural loss, that I'm not respected as an individual, and that's what drives, I think, feelings of resentment and anger and indignity, and therefore a demand for recognition. And that's what a lot of our politics is about. So when we talk about identity politics, we're really talking about a politics of recognition. Do you recognize me, my situation, my lived experience, and do you respect it? And it also leads to this phenomenon of political correctness, because if you violate that norm of recognizing people's status, it's unacceptable in a society that is devoted to equal recognition. Now, I think what's been going on, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, is that the politics of the left has shifted over the last 30 years from one that it was heavily based on economics and class to one that is increasingly based on identity. So, the socialist or social democratic parties in Europe were all based on trade union members, working class, kind of members of the dominant ethnic communities in France and Germany and the Netherlands and so forth, as was the Democratic Party in the United States since the 1930s. Its biggest constituent were white working class people that were the most reliable part of the Democratic coalition. And what's been going on is that a lot of, well, so I think the true chronology of it is that the identity politics began on the left, really, with the social movements. I mean, the perfectly necessary social movements that hit the United States, African Americans, women, the LGBT community, disabled, indigenous people. All of these groups were mistreated by society. They had perfectly legitimate claims to recognition of equal dignity, but the language and the framing developed around these groups so that that's the way we tended to think about, you know, many economic issues. And I think the really dangerous thing that's going on right now is that that language of, you know, demand for dignity and respect has been moving from the left to the right. And that's, I think, the, you know, the demons that, you know, in a way our president has kind of awakened because, you know, a lot of white, you know, people say, well, you know, I mean, every other group is allowed to talk about themselves as black or Hispanic or female or whatnot, but I'm a white person. I can't, you know, even refer to myself as white. You know, that's really not fair. And I think we've got a president that is kind of uniquely skilled at feeding off of those kinds of resentments. So he avoids kind of overt, you know, racism, but certainly hits all of the right buttons. You know, Barack Obama was not, you know, not a real American. He loves going after black athletes and celebrities and, you know, and the like. And so I think it's kind of legitimated the rise of white nationalism, kind of ethnic politics on the right among people that a generation ago, I mean, you wouldn't have said, oh, I'm a white person, therefore a victimized minority. You would have said, no, I mean, I'm an American, and my boss is screwing me, so I want better pay. You know, that's my issue, and the Democratic Party is going to help me get that. But today, it's the class issue has been over time being transmuted into this identity issue. So this is where we cycle back into the internet. The internet is great for identity because the tendency of identity is to fragment into ever smaller groups of like-minded people. So it used to be that if you were a conspiracy theorist that thought that Barack Obama was born in Kenya, in any given little small town, you know, maybe around the barbershop there'd be a few people that agreed with you, but a lot of people wouldn't. Today you can go on the internet and wow, there's like tens or hundreds of thousands of people that think that's a correct theory of the way the world is. And so it puts you in touch with these larger communities that you may not even have known existed, and it reinforces your particular view of the world and, you know, therefore the sense of who you are. Now, there's harmless versions of this. So teenagers organize themselves according to music subgenre, you know, exactly what kind of musicians you like to listen to, and, you know, and I mean, I just think that that's part of the way that society organizes itself, and it's inevitable, and, you know, we're not going to be able to go back on it, but I do think it presents a longer-term challenge to democracy, because democracy, basically, it needs national identity. It needs a liberal, open identity that will integrate people into a democratic people. You know, we the people of the United States. That's the way the American Constitution begins. Who constitutes that people? Well, they have to believe that they're a people, you know, that share certain values, beliefs, belief in the rule of law, in constitutionalism, and the like. And I think that it's that countervailing, you know, integrative force that I think our politics has gradually been stripped of, and I'm happy to blame the internet for all of this.